Let's just say that probably could have gone a lot better. If you know what I'm talking about, you know the Jets just got their butts whooped by the Stars. Find out why on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Good evening, friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thank you for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDON to get up to $20 off your first purchase. Stay tuned to hear more about how Game Time can save you time and money on your next ticket purchases. Now, like I said, the Jets just finished their game against the Dallas Stars, and to put it lightly, it was an absolute disaster class. The Jets really just kind of got run over. You'll look at the scoreline and maybe think it didn't seem quite as bad as I'm describing it to be, but it was pretty awful. I really don't know if I have a lot of praise to give out in this game, so let's talk about what did work. We saw Ehlers have a couple of nice plays. Nemesnikov finally broke his goal-scoring drought, a nice little power play goal, and that's pretty much where the praise ends. If you're having an evening where your top line might be the best line of the entire night and one of the players on said line gets benched for the entire third period, you're probably getting a sense it was an absolute nightmare. And this game, I think, really served as a major measuring stick for the Jets. And honestly, I'm really obviously talking this loss up as a real crappy thing, but I think it was also a necessary thing, right? The Jets honestly needed a wake-up call. The last few weeks or months, really, we've seen the Jets kind of fall into a lot of bad habits. Some of the line combos just not really making sense. And maybe this loss is what's going to remind the Jets of how far they really have to go before we start really, really getting excited about a super deep playoff run, right? The Jets have a lot of work to do, but it's relatively fixable, and a trade deadline is next Friday, right? Winnipeg is in a really good spot to address a lot of the concerns that we're seeing in this game, but I think the biggest overriding thing that was a bit frustrating, right? Dallas has used a very similar game plan against the Jets in all of their wins this year. And this is the third straight victory against Winnipeg with just one more in April before the playoffs. And, the road's going to go through Dallas if the Jets want to get through the Central and get to the conference finals. So the Jets are going to have to figure out how to beat this team at some point. And I think what Dallas did, so effectively was once they had the lead, they basically just suffocated and silenced the Jets for much of the game. And it wasn't like Winnipeg didn't have chances. They definitely did. But for the most part, right, Dallas frustrated and disrupted everything that the Jets like to do. And it was especially noticeable once Dallas kind of left the first period, because with a 3-0 lead, yes, you heard that right, a 3-0 first period lead, yikes, Dallas was able to just sort of dump the puck and just let the Jets wear themselves out trying to create opportunities. And then off of those shifts where the Jets were then tired, Dallas had the extra speed and skill to create odd man situations and probably could have had a couple more goals had Hellebuyck not been really, really good in net. So very frustrating evening. Thankfully, the Jets didn't get shut out, but I think you're seeing a lot of what we've kind of talked about over the past few weeks and months in that Winnipeg is obviously a very good team, and I think no one is really disputing that, but they still need like a top 6 forward and probably some sort of a defender for that right side. Pionk and Dillon got absolutely annihilated, and, some of the other players, Schmidt, wasn't exactly far behind. So really tough outing. Again, I'm really struggling to say what you could view as positives from this game because we just didn't really see a lot that I would say qualifies. I guess the only positive thing is that Bones finally decided to change some of the lines. The problem is that none of the line combos were all that great or inspiring. So, yes, I guess he made an adjustment. It's kind of late to be doing that, though, when you're not going to have a lot of time in between, games here over the next several weeks to practice and mess around with these lines. And you know what he didn't do? Reunite Ehlers, Scheifele, and Velarde, which is like the only line combo on the top line that has been just amazingly dominant. And then even stranger, we saw Velarde get benched for the entirety of the third period. And I don't really know if he's injured or if this was just a performance-based thing. Because if it's performance-based, I don't really know what Velarde's supposed to do, right? I watched Scheifele and Connor struggle together, and then Velarde's looking for opportunities and outlets and stuff, and none of those guys just seem to really be on the same page. And so Velarde being the one to then get swapped with Nemesnikov just doesn't really compute for me. I don't get it. It's for me, it's pointing fingers in the wrong direction. The coaching staff, I really feel like continues to miss the assignment at times. And in these games where you really need help getting from point A to point B, you've got to have a plan C, right? And the Jets just don't really seem to reach that echelon at times when it's kind of down to crunch time. So very frustrating loss. Again, not a lot that I would say is positive, but if you're looking for like a major takeaway, I think the most important thing is to just understand this is kind of where the Jets sit in the Western Conference, right? They are definitely one of the elite teams in the Central, but they still need a couple of things to really push them over the edge. And they've also got to get the coaching staff on the same page with how these lines are being deployed because, having Ehlers not on that first line with Scheifele and Velarde for me is just a cardinal sin. I know people will say, Ehlers can't be the solution to every problem, and of course not. But he's a solution to one particular problem that has so many downstream impacts on the rest of the team that you might actually solve a couple of issues. Having a dominant first line then lets you start to rearrange your top, your middle six and your top nine overall to get a more, I would say, balanced and dominant force, right? As it is right now, the Jets are really reliant on individual talent to kind of carry the day, and the Jets just don't have the finishing ability for that. So very frustrating loss, probably a big wake-up call. I don't know what lessons we're going to see the front office take from this, but I'm sure Chevy already knew and, was planning to make some acquisitions. He's not, going to be naive about this, right? I wouldn't expect him to feel like this team is in a good spot right now because it is in a good spot in the standings, but certainly when you look at the top contenders in this conference and in the East, the Jets just maybe don't stack up as well as we'd like, right? But with one or two acquisitions and a few lineup tweaks, I think this team is going to be in a much better state. So it's really imperative that next Friday, by the end of that trade deadline, the Jets are looking at a newer roster. And we'll talk about what I'm excited about and what I'm concerned about heading into that trade deadline, which is going to be really pivotal for Winnipeg, maybe one of the most important in Jets' recent history in just a little bit. Before we get into all of that, though, and get into trade deadline anxieties, I did want to shout out our friends and partners at Game Time. Obviously, when it comes to buying tickets, it can be a bit of a frustrating experience. A lot of you have probably bought concert tickets or sporting event tickets, and it's a pain in the butt every single time. You get hit with surprise charges, hidden fees, and at times it gets really expensive. I mean, I've bought plenty of tickets in my lifetime, and I can tell you going to a game isn't like it used to be. You get hit with a lot of surprise fees, and worst of all, you sometimes buy seats with really bad views, and you don't even know it until you get there and you find out your view's actually pretty obstructed, seats uncomfortable, whatever. You know the deal. Game Time totally gets that same struggle, and they want to offer you the best and easiest platform to not only buy great last-minute tickets and flash sales, but also you'll get an in-venue seat view if it's available, because they want to make sure that when you're forking out cash for a ticket, you're getting the best experience possible, and you'll always know where you stand with the fees because they put the prices up front, and they want to make it very transparent. And again, like I said, they also offer great flash sales and they offer killer last minute deals. Best of all, you get backed by a lowest price guarantee and event cancellation protection. So if you're like me and you want to take the guesswork out of buying tickets, Go with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase with Game Time. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are checking in on the Jets and what was not exactly the happiest way to spend a few hours watching the Dallas Stars kind of crap kick the Jets a bit, but maybe it was a necessary thing. You know, Winnipeg has kind of cruised through a lot of the season, and there's been a few moments where they've had some really big hurdles, mostly due to injuries, but in terms of getting vastly outplayed by a much superior team, we haven't seen that often until the last few months. It started to shift, and ever since Connor came back, obviously, with the way that Bones likes his lines, we've seen the Jets' 5v5 performance really start to tank. So, food for thought, but I wanted to talk about what I'm excited about and concerned about heading into this upcoming trade deadline, because the Jets have a really big opportunity and a lot of inherent risk of potentially blowing it if they don't make the right moves. We'll get into why in just a moment, but just thought I'd also shout out something really cool the Locked On Network is doing. We have launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and it's now available on Amazon Fire TV in the free Fire TV channels app as well. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with our local experts and international shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now available on the free Fire TV channels app. Now, circling back to the Jets and the upcoming trade deadline, this might be one of the biggest TDLs in Jets history. And look, the Jets haven't exactly had a lot of these, right? But when it comes to moments where you could potentially alter the path of your franchise for at least a couple of months, this has the potential to be a really pivotal moment for the Jets, because if they play their cards right, they could put themselves in a really good spot to compete for the cup, right? Winnipeg is in a very tough conference and division, but you know what? This team has shown at times that they have been willing to rise to the occasion, and I think they'll do it again, especially as we start nearing the postseason playoff picture. But until then, the Jets kind of need some help, and it's not going to be stuff that you can just do internally. As much as I love Chibrikov or Lambert or McGroarty, McGroarty might be the only player among that group that is likely to spend some time with the Jets this season. So that being the case, you've got to look for some other ancillary options, right? And I think for the Jets, they need more than just ancillary support. They need someone kind of beefy and kind of big and skilled. And I don't just mean size-wise, I mean in terms of influence on the ice, which is why we spent some time yesterday kind of revisiting Washington and Philadelphia as potential trade partners. There's some other names that have been floated out there. You know, Vlad Tarasenko out of Ottawa has kind of been suggested as an option. I would say the Jets would probably be wise to steer away from that, because Tarasenko is one of those guys who's really gifted offensively, but it's in the Kyle Connor sense, where a lot of the other parts of his game, and especially the defensive side of things, not really translating super well. I would also say Winnipeg really needs to focus on that blue line position, because I think we're seeing the absolute limits of what Pierre-Luc can do on a pretty consistent basis. And the run of form that he's been on for the past month and a half or so has been especially bad. It's been back to kind of what we thought might happen once he arrived with Winnipeg. Maybe not nearly as bad as often. He's had more, stronger defensive reads versus when he first started, but overall, it's just not been a good time for him. So if the Jets can find a way to start sheltering his minutes a little bit more effectively by bringing in another right-sided D who can really be aggressive and move the puck effectively, that'd be great. That's why I'm really high on the Sean Walker train. I think, missing on Tanev obviously hurt. Tanev would have been a stellar defensive upgrade, and him going to the Stars is a huge problem for the Jets. I ain't going to lie. But by the same token, I also think the Jets might have waited for a better defender in Walker, not because he defends outright better than Tanev does, but because he brings more offensive flexibility, puck movement, and transition, right? That's stuff that I think Winnipeg's back end really needs, and Walker could potentially be that kind of player. He might be the Neil Pionk that the Jets have been looking for, instead of what we're actually getting with Neil Pionk right now. So That would be a huge upgrade, and I really think the Jets have to hit a home run on whatever forward that they bring in. Unfortunately, compared to last time or the past few weeks when I was identifying some trade candidates, we've seen some changes in the standings for a few teams that I thought originally were going to be sellers, and now they've climbed somehow back into the playoff picture. So I'm primarily looking at Detroit because Detroit had some really cool players that I thought might be great for the Jets. Chief among them, Daniel Sprong, would have been a fantastic solution to Winnipeg's top 9 problem, but it seems like with the Red Wings really in a legit competitive race, they're probably not going to be selling. I suspect a number of other teams like Philadelphia and some of those other borderline squads might also be a little bit on the fence. If I'm the Flyers, I kind of feel like, just speaking from a very biased perspective, but also looking objectively at what their problems are, I would not be as keen to hold on to stuff if I thought this would be a good time to start the retooling process, because obviously the Flyers have some really cool talent, but you know what? It's not going to help you when they're like 29 or 30 and you're trying to rapidly turn over into a younger roster and you just don't have the space and time to do so, which means that the Jets might have a really good chance to make a good deal that works for both parties. I've talked about Konechny, which is probably not happening, but it's nice to dream. I've talked about Walker. Maybe some other outside opportunities like Frost if they really weren't happy with him, but it seems like he's really earned himself back in towards his favor. So can't see that really being an option, but crazier things have happened in the past, just not very often. So key distinguishing thing. My big worry, I guess, with this whole trade deadline, if the Jets unfortunately run into a bit of a brick wall, is that there's not going to be many opportunities for this team to swing big and actually get rewarded for it. This feels like one of those seasons that's a bit of a unicorn, right? The playoff field is wide open. The Jets have a pretty strong roster with the goalie playing at the best level of his career, and he's already had a Vezina season, likely to have a second Vezina season. You would be crazy not to think that this might be your shot. I thought it was in 2017, 2018, but with Hellebuck playing at the level that he is right now and how defensively structured this team has gotten under Bones, this might be the season where Winnipeg really should think about swinging for the fences and trying for one of these big name forwards. Now, Andy Strickland, I believe it was, hopped on Winnipeg Sports Talk the other day with Hustle-Rama and said that right now the sense is that Buchnevich is not going to get traded out of St. Louis at the deadline, which for the Jets kind of sucks. But it could just be one of those things where they're trying to sort of tamp down a bit on the trade speculation, because like the Blues are also hovering around a postseason spot. They're sniffing a wild card. It's not great and it's not very firm, but it would be better than what they had under Berube earlier this year, although I don't know if that's really, a streak that I would necessarily put a lot of stock in. But for the Jets, you really got to find some way to pry one of these top 6 forwards out there, even if it's just a rental. Maybe this is the time that Jake Gensel could come to the Jets. I don't know who's going to be particularly interested in waiving and coming to the Jets, because a few of these guys will have trade protections, and the Jets are going to have to do some real marketing work here to sell them on a playoff rental run. But hey, if any team could potentially do it and offer some really cool players and really skilled guys a chance to thrive alongside some really talented players like Scheifele and Ehlers and Connor, this is a good team, and they have a really good shot at going on a deep playoff run. So lots of food for thought. Hoping the Jets don't screw this up. I really can't take another heartbreaker like we saw against Fleury a few years ago, but either way, at least the Jets have made most of the journey this year fun. So cross your fingers the journey actually ends in something truly meaningful. Now, in between there, I did want to save one last topic for the end here, because it's probably my least favorite topic, but we really got to talk about what Bones is cooking. I've sort of alluded to me not necessarily agreeing with Rick's decisions over the past few months and last season before. You've heard me kind of question the coaching staff, and oftentimes I'm sort of looking at Rick for this one. He kind of has to wear this a little bit more, and I think it's tough because he's in a really hard position with what he's balancing in terms of his locker room dynamics, and also because he has his own archetypes and stuff that he really likes to stick with. We'll talk about what some of his line changes and decisions have led to, and whether it's really working or whether he needs to rethink his strategy in just a little bit. Before we go too much further, though, I do want to shout out our friends and partners at Sleeper. It's past the halfway point of the season, and the Winnipeg Jets are still fighting for first in the Central, and honestly, also fighting for first in the NHL. Pretty cool that you can say that about a Jet season, because it's certainly a bit of an alien experience for us. I know I was not expecting them to be at the top of the standings this year, but somehow they found their way up there. They continue to fight, but regardless of where the Jets are in the standings, I want to remind you that you could win big by playing daily fantasy hockey on Sleeper, the official daily fantasy app of the Locked On NHL Network. Sleeper is our number one choice for daily fantasy sports, and especially hockey, because with Sleeper, you could win 100 times your cash in daily fantasy hockey contests. For you stats nerds who love tracking all of the latest metrics and fanciest little stats that you can find, whether it's save percentage or other stats that are very helpful for tracking for top stars like McDavid, Crosby, Ovechkin, you name it, they've got it tracked. If you beat Sleeper's projections for a game, whether it's more or less for that player, you could potentially win big, because if you pick 8 stats categories and get those projections correct for a given game, you could win 100 times your cash. That's right, 100 times your bet with 8 correctly predicted stats categories. So start paying attention and nail your picks so you can start winning big. Use promo code LOCKEDONNHL and you'll get up to a $100 match on your very first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. That's code LOCKEDONNHL. See Sleeper's terms of use for details and locational availability. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode, as we are just wrapping up in just a moment here, talking about, honestly, some of the questionable lineup decisions and stuff that we've seen recently from the Jets. I think the coaching staff, and in particular Bowness, has, he's had some idiosyncrasies that we've discussed in previous seasons. And I think, a lot of what the Dallas fans said when he first arrived in Winnipeg, he was like, oh, you're going to regret this and you're not going to like his decisions. He's, very old fashioned. And I think a lot of that is true, right? Rick has, I would say, his vision for this team. It's a very defensively sound team, very physical, and a squad that he wants to play, I would say, responsible, lower event hockey. The thing with the Jets is that they're honestly not built at times to do some of that stuff when they use players like Connor in really elevated roles, especially top line roles like we're seeing now with Scheifele. That whole sort of top line issue really screws up the rest of the matchups, right? Because if your first line doesn't control play on the ice and doesn't keep their opponents further up defending more, you find yourself in a real hole, because then both the first line and the other lines have to constantly take defensive zone shifts and spend a lot more time trying to get the puck up the ice, which burns a lot of energy. It's really unfavorable if you're the team that's constantly having to shovel the puck out and push it up the ice. It's not really how you want to play the game. You want to control that possession and control and dictate the tempo, and the Jets have not been able to do that recently. And I feel like Bones wants to do all of these other combos that don't actually resolve the problem. We saw a funny one tonight where Velarde got benched, whether it was for injury or his performance, hard to say. I heard somebody mention that he was stretching his legs a bit, so maybe it is injury. But if it's not, and it was performance-based, the solution that, Bones and the staff decided made sense was to put Nemesnikov up there with Connor and Scheifele, which if you're chasing a game, you're already down like 3-0 or 3-1. Why is that the solution? I like Nemesnikov, I really do. I think he's a fun player, and I think he's really carved himself out a beautiful middle six role. But if you're asking him to be the guy to save you on your top line, you might have bigger issues. And I think the adjustments and standards that the Jets have made, and or in the case of standards, some of the ways that they hold certain players accountable for their mistakes while others seemingly get away scot-free, I just don't know. It creates a really weird environment, and I feel like the Jets fell into this trap last year, and it ended up collapsing part of their season, especially when they also just couldn't seem to buy a goal. I don't think that's going to happen this year, but if the Jets don't make some serious decisions heading into the postseason, they're not going to have a deep run. Winnipeg's really got to be smarter about these line deployments, and they've got to get away from overly relying on players like Lowry and Appleton, which, look, I love Lowry, and I think he's actually had a really good season, but you kind of notice that he's not really a prominent scoring threat. He gets into all the right areas, he's constantly attacking the slot, and he does a great job of creating offense down low. But how often does he punch it in the back of the net? not enough. And that's where you really need your skill players to be the ones getting those minutes and really pushing the pace. But, Winnipeg, it just feels like they're caught between a couple of different minds. And until they kind of recognize that they're not built necessarily to run the top line that they're using right now, they're going to struggle, right? If you change and make those adjustments that I've suggested, I think you'll have a much better time. We already saw one line combo that worked really well and allowed the Jets to roll the other three lines to their liking. But if you don't do that, if you keep getting shelled and you keep finding yourself pinned deep, you're never going to escape this vortex of suckage that the Jets are finding themselves in when they're facing faster, better teams. This stuff even happens against weaker, scrappier teams like the Yotes and the Hawks. It took overtime twice in a row to beat those teams, and they're supposed to be bottom feeders. That's not good enough for a team that really has stated it's setting its sights on a deep playoff run. And that Jets, they got to be better than that. I know that they can be. I fully believe that after next Friday, we're going to have some, hopefully better acquisitions, some really big names to join this team. I'm just crossing fingers because I think this team is too special to let, a great season go to waste. This team has a lot of potential for a fun playoff run. I want to see them do the thing and hoist a cup. It's certainly been a long time coming. And after being robbed of it a few years ago, I'm hungry for a big championship title, and I know a lot of you are too. A lot of you watch this team, the first iteration, walk out the door, and now you want to see the second iteration really live up to the hype and deliver what's been promised. And I think if there was ever a year to do it, this just might be the dang one. So cross your fingers for a better performance. Tomorrow's episode will probably spend some time previewing the game against Carolina and also discussing one or two trades that have popped up. Ilya Lyubushkin just got traded to Toronto. Thought it might be worth addressing that one. Not deeply, but, spend a few minutes talking about what it means for the market and some weird stuff and, what it will also do for Winnipeg's own trade interests, because Lyubushkin is technically a defender, and that means one guy off the market. Maybe it pushes more attention to guys like Walker. We will see on tomorrow's episode. But for tonight's show, that is going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. Be sure to tune in tomorrow for even more Jets coverage. So, as always, thanks so much for listening and subscribing. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets, go.